Hello, welcome back to Loki's Librarian. I am the librarian Katrina. If you are new here, welcome. This is where I am reading through the enormous library of books you see behind me, and then I give you a quick synopsis and tell you what I think about the book of the week. So, if you like books and just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos, let me know what you think in the comments. This week's book of the week has been in my library for a while, and I decided to pull it off my shelf and read it because I really do need to start reading through my existing library. Despite people are now actually gifting me with books, which is awesome. I'm not complaining, not even a little bit, but it's kind of, it's a genuine conundrum, right? I mean, I have all these already in existence and people keep giving me more. So I've got to start reading through some of what I already have. So this week's book of the week is Dead Men Do Tell Tales by Dr. William R. Maples, The Strange and Fascinating Cases of a Forensic Anthropologist. Yes. Okay. The other thing I've been doing is I have been adding topical cocktails to the mix this last year. And so this week's cocktail comes from this other book, Tarot and Tequila. I mean, I don't think that Dr. Maples believed in tarot. He seemed kind of more like he was a little more grounded than that. I think he was spiritual, but not mystical, right? But if you've ever heard of tarot, you know that every deck has a death card. And this book has a death cocktail. So let's do this. This will be interesting. I haven't had tequila in a really long time.
It's been 84 years.
It's okay, just try to remember anything at all.
I don't remember much about the night, but I remember the Tequila Hangover, which lasted 2 days. So tequila hasn't really been in my rotation. I actually had to go out and buy a bottle of tequila. So here we go. This week's book is a little bit of an autobiography. A little bit of an autobiography, but not much, all right? It's mostly the stuff he worked on against his life, because this was his life. This is what he did. So I start with 1.5 ounces of Blanco Tequila. I went with Tequila Exotico. Again, not sponsored. This is just what I found that was cheap. 1.5 ounces. Tequila Blanco. The basic autobiography is that Dr. Maples was born August 7th, 1937 in Dallas, Texas, and one of his childhood memories includes seeing the autopsy photos of Bonnie Parker of Bonnie and Clyde fame.
Here is Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, who died as they lived, by the gun.
Who was actually buried in the cemetery not too far from Maples' childhood home in Dallas. Now, I don't think, and he doesn't seem to think either, that there was any kind of an actual connection between the two. It was more like a macabre coincidence, but it impacted him enough that he felt that it needed to be mentioned in his story. So that's why I'm including it here in the recap. He ended up going to college. He received a bachelor's degree in English, I think with a minor in anthropology. And while in college, he worked as a mortuary assistant, which in the late 1950s, early 1960s meant kind of being a literal ambulance chaser. They would drive the ambulance, and the first mortuary there got to claim the body for burial purposes. So that's kind of dark, but I was like, oh my gosh. So he worked for the mortuary to kind of drum up business. Dark as that sounds. And then he attempted to get a master's degree, I forget what, but it was something unrelated, before quitting school briefly and worked as an insurance investigator, which he described as really depressing work where you mostly encounter con artists. I buy it. And like I said, people never change, right? I've been learning that through the President books. Okay, so I need a 1/2 ounce of Mezcal. Part of his, so he worked briefly as this insurance investigator, and then he contacted the professor he met when he got his minor in anthropology, which was Dr. Tom McKern, who was a forensic anthropologist. Okie dokes. And and said, hey, you know, what about getting that PhD? Because Dr. McKern had said, don't get your master's, just go straight to the PhD program. For certain programs, that's absolutely a possibility. He was going to bypass that, decided, yeah, no, that's what I'm going to do. I don't want to do this whole master's thing. It's not working out, but I'll go straight for the PhD. So he signed on as a student of Dr. McKern's and began studying for his doctorate degree in forensic anthropology. I said a 1/2 ounce of Mezcal. So, part of his studies took him to Africa for a period of time, where he helped to trap baboons for medical tests, which the descriptions of that were kind of dark, but then, you know, I'm judging it again from this 40 years, for 50 years after the fact, 60 years. Oh my God, it's been 60 years after the fact of animal testing. Oh my God, how awful. But the reality is, a lot of our medical advances are made off animal testing. All right. Now, the processes have gotten better so that it's a lot more humane than it used to be. But the descriptions of his darting baboons, and he talks about one that bit him and tore through one of his arteries and almost cost him his arm because of the bacterial infection. But he's great because he's like, well, I don't hold any grudges. He did what he had to do. I did what I had to do. Kudos for you, Doc, for recognizing that this is what it was, right? The baboon didn't want to go with you, and it was literally your job to make him go. So, well done. Both of his daughters were born in Africa, and then he returned to the United States and gradually began to build a practice as a forensic anthropologist. Now, how was one build a practice in death, basically? By becoming very good and being the very best at it. It says 2 ounces of fresh lime juice. I did not get limes. I should have. I'm going to start doing the garnishes, I think, but for now we're just going to do 100% real lime juice from concentrate. This is going to change it because it says with added ingredients, but whatever. We're going to see how this goes. 2 ounces? 2 ounces fresh lime juice. Oh my God, I can already smell the tequila, and it's like those little salivary glands. It's like I'm remembering the hangover, so we'll see. I don't know. We'll see how this goes. So how do you build a practice as a forensic anthropologist? You become very good at your job. You have one person bring in a body and say, hey, I need help with identification or determining cause of death, and you do it well enough for it to hold up in court. You start to build a reputation, and that's what happened. So it's like 1973 or 4, he got his first cold case, if you will, where they brought in just this skull cap, so just this very back part of his skull, of a skull, and they were trying to determine how the woman died. They already had a suspect in custody who had basically said he was trying to claim it was an accidental death, and the doctor from this tiny little skull cap was able to prove that her head had been like bashed in with the backside of a hatchet, which the guy ended up confessing to eventually and went away. So that was pretty impressive, and that's how he started to build a practice. And he eventually became like world renowned. Like he was a recognized name in the field, and we're going to get to where that will take you by the end of the report. So that's the short version. I mean, he was born in 1937. In the mid 60s, he was in Africa, and then he returned to the States in the 70s. This book was written in 1994, and Dr. Maples himself died in 1997. So I don't know what changes or advances have been made. I like to think that had he lived longer, there would be an updated codicil saying, hey, these are additional changes and advances in the field. Well, we won't know, right? Based on his writing, based on the way he wrote this, I think that, bones don't lie. That's what he said multiple times. And this was a man who was grounded in science. He wasn't really prone to flights of fancy, and he tried very hard to keep the fanciful out of his writing and out of his work. Okay, this is the fun one. The last ingredient for the cocktail is 1 ounce of activated charcoal syrup, which I had to make myself, and yes, he included the recipe for how to make it. Let's see here. Pour carefully, I don't want activated charcoal all over my desk. 1 ounce. There we go. Okay. I think he has a lot of empathy for people, and that comes a lot across in his writing. But science is science, and bones don't lie. If you were born a male, your skeleton will reflect that upon death. It doesn't matter how you identify as in real life. And gender non-binary is a psychological pathology, not an actual medical condition. See a shrink. And I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he would say. No. I'm guessing. I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that's what he would say. The bones will out. And thank God for that. Thank God for that. Because that gives us something definitive, or else hundreds of murder victims would remain unidentified because of how they identified in life. Your bones don't lie. Your bones are going to tell the true story. And he addresses transgenderism, which was really interesting. Right? Now, this did not say to shake it over ice, so I did not put ice in the shaker. So yeah, thank God there's something definitive, like all the way to the core, or we wouldn't be able to tell something as simple as gender. Like as biologically fundamental as gender would be gone at death. That's so grim. It's like gray. So let's go into some of what Dr. Maples talks about, like specifically. He talks about early pathology, not just anthropology, but when he was a mortuary attendant, he'd have to wait for a pathologist to show up to announce cause of death. often without benefit of an autopsy. He'd just show up and be like, heart attack, car crash, and, you know, without actually knowing what happened. Like, did the heart attack cause the car crash, for example? He talks about our, like, humanity's kinship with the baboons, and that's kind of why baboons were being chosen. They're basically the only other species that can get coronary disease based on diet, so cholesterol levels will rise based on their diet. Them and us, humans and baboons, that's it. So that's why they were chosen, because they were studying cholesterol. And their sexual dimorphism kind of helps assist that. How is cholesterol built in men versus women? Doesn't change. Hasn't changed from 94 to the present, despite what the political ideologues want you to think. Now, he discusses how he gradually built that reputation, becoming trusted among law enforcement and the U.S. military. He played a significant role in building the program that helps to identify military remains from Korea and Vietnam, ensuring that soldiers who are left behind are reunited with their families. And he's helped solve murders. So many murders. The woman with the skull cap, to a murder that crossed state lines, literally New Hampshire, Florida, Alaska. This couple was everywhere, and he tracked them down and concluded that it was a murder-suicide, and the bodies were there. He helped solve a mass murder where they couldn't find the weapon, but he was still able to identify the weapon based on the marks left on the bones. I mean, it's pretty impressive. And he gives precise scientific detail on how a body decomposes and which conditions are best for preservation. He discusses the absolute horror and difficulty of identifying a dismembered body. And he's not talking about dismemberment where the bones were left out and animals scattered them. He's talking about somebody hacked it apart with a chainsaw dismemberment. Oh, God. It's not bad. You definitely taste the lime. The gray is a little disturbing, but it's not bad. You can taste the lime. So it's very citrusy. So the lime is definitely the predominant flavor that I'm getting there. He talks about what happens if you commit suicide via hanging and the body is left in the middle of nowhere. So if you go out to a forest to try and kill yourself quietly, eventually your body weight is going to pull your head right off your body. Whoa. When a body is buried, there's actually minimal insect activity because the bugs need oxygen too. So burying the body will actually preserve it longer than just leaving it open to the elements. Note, if you're a killer, this is not advice for you. Just don't, all right? You be as disgusting as you, because that makes it more likely that we're going to catch you. So I'm just saying. There were specifically 2 murders that he helped solve that he went into great detail on. The first one was the Lavelle drug murders in 1981, where they basically had an informant say, hey, I witnessed or was part of these murders in the middle of the woods, led them right to the bodies, and they had to dig them up and prove what happened. Because proof, right? You have to have that to actually execute somebody, but to try them, you have to have proof too. So Dr. Maples and his colleagues unearthed the remains and then proved that the first body buried was the last body shot. And that ended up being supported by their eyewitness, who said, yeah, that guy begged not to be killed, so they made him crawl into the grave first, and then they shot his 2 colleagues over him before leaning around them and shooting him. So that's sadistic as fuck. And then the other one was the Meek Jennings murder-suicide. And this one went all over because the Glide Earl Meeks had actually killed Paige Jennings' parents in New Hampshire first. And then set the hotel they lived in, because they owned a hotel, and he set it on fire trying to mask it. Now the fire didn't burn, didn't take, and so their bodies were left. But there was basically a lot of question as to whether or not he was in fact dead, because 2 other bodies, which ended up being Paige Jennings and Glide Earl Meeks, were found burned to a crisp. And the bones were just a total wreck because they at the time, this happened in the mid-'80s, the law enforcement in Florida thought that he was still out of the country in Peru, I think. He was not, but they didn't know that, so they just bagged all the bones up together and left it to him to sort out, which he did. And was able to prove that, yes, Meek did in fact kill himself and Jennings. They were both there. Meek was not still on the run. But it took New Hampshire a while to get Meek removed from the FBI's most wanted, because they didn't want to believe that he was actually dead. They wanted to believe this killer was still out there because political capital. Isn't that disgusting? And that's insane knowledge. That is an insane skill level, to be able to look at just a handful of bones, right? And he talked about a crematorium, and he wouldn't go into details because of non-disclosure agreements, so he left it very broad. But there was a crematorium that was being sued for negligence. Essentially, there was a woman who her family had cremated there, and the cremains were returned to the family, which was interred in the vault. And then, like a month later, a box was found on the side of the road with a bunch of cremains in it, the woman's name on it. So the family was suing the crematorium for negligence, saying, well, no, those aren't really her bones. They can't be because there's this box on the side of the road. And Dr. Maples came in, again with a handful of colleagues, and were able to prove that, yes, the cremains they had in the family vault did belong to the woman. The box, he thinks, there's obviously no proof of this, was the end result of a bitter employee trying to stir up trouble for the crematorium as they left. Possible, certainly. That certainly makes sense. But he was able to prove from a handful of tiny little bone fragments left after cremation that the woman in the vault belonged there. That's so insane to me that somebody can be that skilled. I mean, I believe it. I 100% believe it, because that level, it's a skill I don't have, so I'm in awe of it. But specifically, there were 3 cold cases, I mean, very cold cases, that Dr. Maples helped with absolute identification of either the body or the cause of death. The first one was Don Francisco Pizarro, who was the conqueror of Peru, and he was assassinated on June 26, 1541. So it's a 400-year-old skeleton at this point. After the assassination, which was a brutal, bloody affair, this was not a quiet poisoning. Eyewitness accounts provided by the murderers themselves described the assassination, and basically the body was hacked to bits. After the assassination, Don Pizarro's remains were moved several times, sometimes due to either church reconstruction, sometimes as a result of earthquakes, which required the remains to be moved for safety reasons. And ultimately, he came to rest in a lonely vault. The location was basically forgotten. What caused the bones to come to light was a reconstruction on the church when a lead-lined box was unearthed, and an inscription on the box said, "Here is the head of Don Francisco Pizarro," which made the church sit up and take notice, because they already had one body on display marked Don Francisco Pizarro. So now we have the body that's been, revered and worshipped, and it's got this place of honor in the cathedral, and then this lead-lined box marked, "Here is the head of," and they're going, well, now we got a problem. And so a team was assembled, including Dr. Maples. And they were able to determine, based on the testimony from the eyewitnesses and the actual blade marks left on the skeleton, that the newly found body was in fact that of the conquistador. And the one laying in state was most likely a nameless monk accepting adulation of reflected glory. So Don Pizarro was taken and reinterred in his rightful place, and the monk was respectfully reinterred someplace else. We have no idea who he was, but there were no marks on his body, so there is no way he could have been Don Francisco, because Don Francisco was hacked to death. A lot of lime. It's literally like drinking a limeade. Like, instead of lemonade, limeade, it's kind of what it tastes like. The second cold case was more of a historical curiosity. So on July 9th, 1850, President Zachary Taylor, U.S. president, died in office, becoming the second sitting president to do so. Historically, it was assumed to be some level of food poisoning, like he ate, a bad clam or something and died of food poisoning. The question arose of, was it actual poisoning, like arsenic, for example, in which case Taylor was actually our first assassinated president, not Abraham Lincoln. And there was an author, I don't remember her name, it's in the book, but there was an author who was basically writing a historical fiction. She came across this curiosity and began asking Dr. Maples, hey, what would be the signs of arsenic poisoning, and would it still be on the bones? And he said, yeah, actually it would still be on the bones. Arsenic's a heavy metal. If it's ingested over a long enough period of time, it would absolutely stay on the bones. So yeah, sure, possible. And so the author became very obsessed with it and set about making an autopsy happen, a post-mortem happen, 150 years after, 160 years after the death, whatever it was. 130, okay. I'm getting there. I mean, she basically contacted every single living descendant of Taylor's that she could locate to get permission from each and every one of them. She didn't want to ruffle the family's feathers. She wanted to make sure that it was okay, and they all agreed. The United States almost had a fit, because this is a sitting president. We're going to disinter the body and perform an autopsy, and how rude is that? But ultimately, it happened. They removed the body from the family tomb, which was in Kentucky, and they remove, I think, all of the nails, because that's the most likely height on your nails is where the arsenic would rest. They took hair samples and then reinterred the body. And no, he was not poisoned. The arsenic levels essentially were what you would expect to find in a 19th century corpse, but nothing so over the top that you could say, yes, this was definitely poison. So Dr. Maples remains, or is convinced, that it was a natural death as a result of food poisoning, basically. I don't know. I don't have an opinion on that yet because I haven't read Zachary Taylor yet. He will be, I think, in April. No, I think he's in March. Anyways, he's next year sometime. Or no, this year. Oh my gosh, 2022. Sometime this year we're getting to Zachary Taylor. I don't know when. We'll get there when we get there. That tangent. The last most famous case Dr. Maples discusses is the Romanovs.
The House of Romanov was the second and last dynasty to rule Russia. It began with the reign of Mikhail Romanov in 1613, ending more than 3 centuries later in the bloody incidents of the Revolution of 1917.
Those Romanovs. After the fall of the Soviet Union, a team of forensic experts were assembled and flown to Russia for the purpose of identifying several bodies that were found in an unmarked mass grave, believed to be the Romanovs, who had been assassinated in a basement in Ekaterinburg in 1917. There were skeletal remains belonging to at least 9 different persons in the grave. There were 11 assassinated in the basement, just to keep it, keep it on the level here. There were 11 assassinated, 9 persons were found. Successfully and conclusively identified were Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, the Grand Duchess Tatiana, Grand Duchess Olga, Grand Duchess Marie, family physician Dr. Botkin, the Tsar's footman, and the Tsarina's lady's maid. DNA testing later conclusively proved findings from the bones to be accurate. They were able to conclude with like 98.9% accuracy that the bones of the Grand Duchess, Olga, Marie, Tsarina Alexandra, and Tatiana were related to the royal family in England, which is 100% what you would expect. There was definitely a blood connection there. Missing from the graves were the Tsarevich Alexei and the Grand Duchess Anastasia. Curious, right? Because those were the two persons that people would be most likely to claim they were. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn was in the Gulag Archipelago, he mentions meeting at least one person who claimed that he was the Tsarevich Alexei. And of course, the Grand Duchess Anastasia, there have been multiple people claiming that they were her. As far as I know, they've all been disproven definitively. Dr. Maples, like I said, is not prone to flights of fancy. And so again, based on eyewitness testimonies of the assassins, he is convinced that the bodies just haven't been found yet, as of 1994. They may have been located since, but as of 1994, they had not been found. And he's basing that based on one of the eyewitnesses recalls they took the bodies to basically a mine shaft, dumped them down there, and threw grenades in after it, trying to collapse the mine shaft around the bodies. When that didn't quite work, they went out, they for some reason pulled up 2 of the bodies, and they didn't know which ones at this point, because the bodies, and Dr. Maples describes in detail what the decomposition would have been like. The bodies would have been swollen, they would have been bloated, they would have been black and blue from the blood pooling, and there would have been no way to really identify them just on looks as to who they were. And so those 2 bodies were pulled up, burned, and then reburied, but not with the rest of them, just nearby somewhere. So somewhere in that vicinity, Dr. Maples believed there was the 2 bodies of Alexei and Alexandria. I'm sorry, not Alexandria, Anastasia. Okay, so the book was fascinating. It was really interesting. And sometimes tone can seem cavalier and macabre, but I believe he had genuine empathy for the bones that he handled. And while he states emphatically that bones don't lie, and this is where I was like, okay, kudos for honesty, Doc, because I honestly didn't know. I didn't know, and I wasn't expecting to necessarily find an answer because the book was written in 1994. I didn't know how this would turn out. But he addressed it, and I was like, well, all right. He states emphatically bones don't lie, and yes, you can absolutely tell someone's gender based on their skeletal remains, but you can also tell their preferred gender. And in a book written in 1994, well before the world went mad with these political ideologies based on preferred pronouns, he specifically mentioned that you could tell from bones that were male that the person was undergoing hormone treatment for gender reassignment. I mean, the bones were unequivocally male, but based on the changes to the bone structure and the way the musculature lies along the bones, he could tell if somebody was undergoing gender reassignment. Fucking fascinating. I like this book. It was well written. It was a good story. It touched on the darkness that seems to draw humanity in. And it was written with empathy and care for the victims of crime. And he was just trying to see home. And I have a feeling the ones that he couldn't identify haunt him way more than the ones that he was successfully put to rest. I don't know what's currently going on in the field of forensic anthropology these days. Dr. Maples expressed genuine concern for the future of the field based on lack of funding that goes back to 1994. And one can only hope that the show Bones, while it's no longer on the air, that it fueled enough interest in the field to see it through another generation and to maybe get some more funding. Because as recently as 30 years ago, the field was in no way crowded. And it's by being only one of a very few of these highly skilled professionals that Dr. Maples found himself in a position to be able to examine the bones of Don Pizarro, President Taylor, and the last of the Romanov dynasty. I mean, I've often said if I could go back in time and do it again, I wouldn't go to college, and now I think I would just change my major to forensic anthropology, because this was really interesting. I feel like it's a little late for me. Like, by the time I was done with it, I'd be like, I'm too old to go into fields and examine bones. You young whippersnappers do it. But that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you all next week. Bye.